Hi everyone, this is Rafi. I'm here today with my friend Dennis, my good Twitter friend Dennis. This is the first time actually we're meeting over Zoom. We just had to press record right away because Dennis was telling me about his lab experience and experience in pharmacology and his year of PhD that he did. So actually, if I can be selfish, just take us back to what you were saying because we can just go from there.
Oh, okay, sure. Rafi was telling me about his PhD work, and so way back when, a long time ago, I was in a PhD program in pharmacology. So this was 1979, 80, probably well before a lot of people listening to this were born. And but anyway, it was Rafi was saying that a lot of the work isn't terribly fun. And that's what I saw too when I was doing it. I got into the lab work and saw what people were doing, and I thought this is no fun. And then I also a big thing was all my professors were worried about getting their grants so they
Right.
could be sure they still had a job next year and this kind of thing. And so I decided I didn't want any part of that, and I left after a year. It was just, of course, by then I had already gone through 4 years of university studying hard and getting into grad school and so on and so forth. So by this time I thought, well, yeah, I think I've had enough of this. So I left. But I was also saying, which might be of interest to others about the lab work, is I've done a lot of lab work in my life, working not in scientific research, but in clinical laboratories in hospitals. And the microbiology part is very interesting, and I can even say enjoyable, although the kind of work is plenty stressful because you're
Right.
dealing with real people and patients who are in the hospital and so on. But it's enjoyable because microbiology, you're not only working with living organisms, namely bacteria, which is fascinating to me, because originally that's what I studied way back when, was microbiology. That was what I got my degree in. And but also in microbiology, it's the least automated part of the modern clinical laboratory, and
Right.
you are tasked with solving problems yourself, figuring out, identifying organisms by, to start with, a lot of visual clues and real sort of some basic on-bench lab tests that you can do to rule out certain things. And of course, there's, basically, dozens at least of species of bacteria that are of clinical interest that you see all the time. So in any case, that's all very interesting. But the other part of the clinical lab, which I worked in a lot of my life, for example, clinical chemistry or clinical hematology,
Mm-hmm.
it's not interesting. You're working with big banks of instruments, and you're tasked with feeding specimens into the instruments, making sure the instruments run okay, doing quality control.
Mm-hmm.
Like once a shift, the quality control has to be in range and so on. So that's really kind of very automated and not interesting, and I'm glad I'm not doing that stuff anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny how I think for people who haven't had at least a short amount of lab experience, I think you're, at least that's what I've heard elsewhere, is that people are surprised by how much time is not spent thinking about the scientific concepts and designing studies and, really sort of going through a lot of the exercises that one might do on Twitter, funnily enough, when you're, following threads and looking at people debate and following up on references and stuff. And I find it's sort of I think it's like the death of the subject, really, of these scientific areas where like you're expected to do so much grunt work. I don't know how it was for you, but usually in a lab, you have a lab manager, you have, supporting staff, basically, because it's really important when you're trying to do an experiment that things are ready, things are clean, things like they've thought of all these logistical things, and you can actually do science. But that's not how it works it works in practice. It's that's an ideal, I guess.
Right. And yeah, so in practice, you have to do a lot of it yourself and so on. And yeah, I don't know what the average person thinks, going to grad school and getting a PhD is like, but I'm sure it's far different from what most people think. It's a lot, it is a lot of scut work. And, to me, it's always fascinating learning. I did always enjoy that part about it. But the actual, sitting around all day pipetting things, or, that is not really my cup of tea.
Yeah, mine neither. And I'm not the most, it's not like I don't have, I have like sausage fingers, I guess, but I can do some minute work, but I'm just not careful enough. And I get impatient with things, and you need a better, you need a lot of attention to detail in these circumstances. I just think, honestly, and this is not to say there aren't great male lab workers, but I just think women are they're just better. They're at this stuff. Like, they're more careful. Like, it's kind of like in school, the girls just were doing their homework and fucking around less and just getting on with it. I'm like, you need more of that in a lab. So I always get a lot of help from the females in my lab for what I need to do.
I think it's like anything, any kind of job. This gets, interestingly enough, gets discussed a lot on Twitter too. That the congruence, I guess you could say, between what you learn in college, what you learn getting a degree, versus what actually happens on the job. And certainly in the lab world, in the clinical laboratory world, there's a big difference. I mean, you've got to learn all this theory, and you've got to study organic chemistry, for example. You've got to, and then then plus all the topics in your major, all the bacterial physiology and medical microbiology, and on and on. And then when you get on the job, you're basically not using that stuff. It's like, okay,
we're following.
Here's your first day on the job. Here, I'm going to teach. I'm going to show you what you need to do. And so it's like anything, big disconnect between what you learn in university and what you're doing on the job.
I guess the same is true in medical school to some extent, where a lot of the medicine you're learning is it's not actually the skills to learn new topics and connect disparate topics together to solve a patient's problem. It's really a lot of rote stuff that's being taught in medical school. And yeah, you're getting some good exposure to, of course, real life patients and medicine and all that, but there's a lot of grunt work even there. They could be really cool jobs. That's what I always come back to. I'm like, it would be great to work in academia and do research, but it's just, I don't know. I don't think I will.
Yeah, right. It didn't take long for me when I entered the working clinical laboratory world, to dawn on me that, wait a minute, I didn't really prepare for this. I didn't think this is what I was getting into. I mean, I look back on all that, and I always had the jobs were plentiful and they paid decently and all that sort of thing. So I can't complain about that. I mean, I know, many people along the way, their jobs were, I don't know, obsoleted or something. Like I knew a guy that I worked with once who was a typesetter. He had been a typesetter, so like that job is gone, and they don't exist anymore. So I felt fortunate that I was always able to work and always able to make a good living. Yeah. But that was all. I would kind of wish I had done something more interesting.
But what you do now is pretty interesting.
It is. I'm really doing what I like is I'm doing what I like, and I do find it very interesting. And I get to work from home. I mean, this is well before, all the COVID lockdown stuff happened. I started working from home, and so I get up in the morning and go to my desk and my keyboard, and then I'm working, and I like it. Messing around on Twitter is part of my job, and I find that really interesting, and I always get to learn. So I find that interesting as well, and even I have to keep abreast of things. I mean, obviously, if you have a certain body of knowledge, you have to refresh it from time to time. So that's part of my job too, and now I'm mostly making my living by coaching private clients, and so that's all very interesting. They are for the most part happy with what I'm doing for them, and so yeah, I like that, helping people. So it's great. I have no complaints whatsoever.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I think a lot of people would like to be in that position, and a lot of people should, because to simultaneously have independence, control of your time, and doing something that's rewarding in human terms, and that's of course giving you financial stability. I mean, that's, as far as I'm concerned, that's the jackpot, and that's not everyone gets there, and yeah, that's really cool.
Right. Yeah, it's the jackpot, for sure. And the only regret I have is I wish it hadn't taken me so long to get here. But anyway, right. I'm here now, so yeah. No use worrying about the past.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you more specifically about some of the things you've done with your clients, because I know it's so cool to talk about all the success stories, but I'm actually curious, like, what is the most interesting difficulty you encountered? Like the one that really, where you had to sort of like, reconsider some things and go back and.
Well, yeah, okay, that's interesting. So the vast majority of my clients come to me because they want to lose weight, they want to get better body composition, and so on. So that's as you would expect, right? That's the common problem these days. But there are some that don't have the same problem. I have a client who has suffered from chronic fatigue. So this is something I've had personal experience with. So it's interesting trying to, obviously, what I talk about with them is diet and exercise, right? And maybe some supplements. So, to try and understand what somebody is going through with that, that they've had no success with, getting over. Somebody's had this situation for years. And so, that's something interesting. Many people they're basically glucose intolerant, I guess, for lack of a better term, metabolic syndrome, right? Skinny fat. So I see this a lot, especially I have a number of clients, have had a number of clients from the Middle East, for example, and people there, perhaps even more so than in the West, are used to eating a very high carbohydrate diet. They are not. There's much less of a gym culture there. And so, it's interesting getting them going on this, and
aren't the sodas the big one for them?
Well, in my experience, so most of my clients have come to me with something of head start, let's say, or a beginning. There's some
Okay, gotcha.
understanding of what they need to be doing. So in reality, not many of them are, say, drinking a lot of sodas all day
Right.
long or something like that, right? Because they follow me on Twitter, for example. That's how probably most of them know me, and so they can see what I'm writing, and they try to implement. But you know, they're doing things wrong, definitely. You know, there's still, maybe they're not drinking sodas, but there still might be a fair amount of sugar in their diet, and of course, you know, in many of these cultures, lots of bread, rice, and so on, that they're
Yeah.
eating, you know, large amounts at every meal. So yeah, that's what's going on with them, I'd say.
Right, right. Yeah, that's hard to do. I've done a little bit of coaching myself, and one thing I found is that a lot of men want to put on weight, and some women, some women I've coached as well, and it's hard. Like I mean, fat loss is hard as well, of course, but putting on weight is not. I think there's less pre-existing knowledge when they come to you. I think there's a lot of things people have in mind about fat loss, and because it's the main question people have. But actually, to put on muscle, it's very hard for people. They have to eat more, and especially eat more nutrient dense, high quality animal foods, basically, to a large extent. And they have to be okay eating enough fat, because you know they're usually dropping their carbs if they're also, you know, already in the diet space at this point. So I don't know. It's been an interesting one for me, and it's hard because it's really not just about diet. You have to resistance train, like,
Right. And
otherwise.
yes, absolutely. And I think that people perhaps underestimate just how hard it is. I mean, you're saying, it is hard, but underestimate, for example, just how hard you have to train to put on a substantial amount of muscle. You know, when I talk to people about training, and I describe, I have a general program that, you know, that I adapt for each one, but my style of training that I advocate is pretty tough. And I tell people that, you know, obviously I'm not going to be there in person training with them. So I tell them, well, you know, what do you expect? What to expect from your training? And I tell them that if at the end of your training session you don't feel spent, then then maybe, you know, you need to reevaluate, because this is tough. It's really tough. If you go through it and you think at the end of it, oh, that wasn't too bad, well then, wait a minute, you know, that it's supposed to be very tough. So it's very hard training. You often, not necessarily from my clients or people I talk to, but just sort of in general, you often hear, you know, people say, maybe on Twitter or something, oh, but I don't want to become a bodybuilder. I don't want to get too muscled or something like that.
Don't worry about it, bro.
Yeah, don't worry about that, man. It doesn't happen by accident. You know,
you won't trip and fall into a bodybuilder.
That's right. That's right. And as far as people who are underweight, I think a really common thing is that they underestimate or no, overestimate how much they really eat. They think, you know, you'd say, oh, well, you know, okay, what are you eating? And then they tell you, and it's like, yeah, well, no wonder. You know, you gotta eat more. Of course, there's other things involved too. If somebody's not hungry, they can't, and they don't feel like they can get that much food into them. Sure, right? That's understandable. But generally, they're overestimating how much they're really eating, I think.
Yeah, I think so, because it's kind of the mirror image of what happens for fat loss, where people underestimate how much they're eating. And it's probably having to do with appetite, changing your perception of size, literally. I think, I don't know if that's true, but I think there's a sense where, you know, when you're hungry, you go to a shop and we say, oh, your eyes are bigger than your stomach, meaning, you know, you don't have the right measure of it, basically. And I think that's kind of the point. of hunger and not being hungry is that it's going to push you more so in one direction than the other, and to do that it has to be biased in a sense. um,
Yeah, right. So, I mean, hunger is it's just so central to everything, to the high obesity rates in the Western world and all that. So, I mean, yes,
yeah.
well, okay, people are eating too much. Why are they eating too much? Well, they're hungry is a really obvious answer. I don't think that's entirely it, but
Mhm.
that's a large fraction of it, is they're hungry. And
Yeah.
so you try to get to the roots of why people are hungry. Well, they're eating the wrong things generally, and so they stay hungry, and then they eat too much. So yeah, controlling hunger is really big. It's just essential for any kind of permanent fat loss.
It's actually hard for me to imagine how that must feel, because the only experience I've had when my hunger is sort of abnormal, it's when like you're sick and you don't want to eat, or when you're nauseated for some reason, or when you have the munchies and you're like hungry, but you can tell that you're not in lack of nourishment. You're just like, yeah, just want something, and it's at a different level than normal hunger, I would say, because it's sort of decoupled from the usual pattern, because you can just get it to jump up. So I don't know. It's that's the only experience I have with dysregulated hunger. But for people who have a weight issue in terms of they're just way too fat, um, I'm not sure if do you think so? It depends how you play with the arrow of causality. Do you think their hunger gets fucked up and they get fat? Or do you think something like their fat cells get messed up and then they're hungry? That's the consequence of sucking up fat more than you should. Where do you see that arrow? Because I'm biased towards the fat cell.
Right. It's a very interesting question, and of course, this gets debated a lot. I mean, I was just saw something this morning. Gary Taubes
Mhm.
talking to somebody about this on Twitter.
Yeah, you read my
He's
mind.
Yeah, right. So Gary Taubes is obviously, fat cell dysregulation. The fat's getting sucked up into fat cells, and then so people are hungry. And there's there's plenty of evidence for this. However, you look at the other side of the equation, for which I think there's good evidence for. And let me just say, before I get into this, it's like I'm not going to settle this question right here, so I can only
Ah, shit.
present what I think. But I think that the protein leverage hypothesis of obesity is pretty compelling. So
Interesting.
protein leverage hypothesis says that basically all animals, not just humans, not just mammals, but all mammals, or all animals, excuse me, seek a certain amount of protein in their diet. And when they don't get enough protein, they'll eat more. So they're looking for an absolute amount of protein. And if
Mhm.
the food that they're eating is lower in protein, then they'll have to eat more of it to get that absolute amount of protein. And this fits with a lot of the data. So, for example, in the United States and much of the Western world, after approximately 1980, when they started telling us to eat less saturated fat, and so people were avoiding meat and so on. Well, and then eating more carbohydrates. As a consequence, the protein content of the food went down as a percentage
Mhm.
of the
And the
food.
quality.
So, and the quality, certainly, yes. And so they had to eat more to get that absolute amount of protein. So, that can explain increased caloric intake. It can explain increased hunger. So, I think that's a really interesting idea. Certainly, A lot of the data shows that higher protein intake decreases hunger. And certainly if you look at, back to these bodybuilders, I always like to use them as examples because they're, like on the far right end of the curve or something for what they're doing. But when they want to get shredded and get to really low body fat, they're eating very high protein. And so that's what I think a lot of it has to do with, as far as, so carbohydrates, right? This gets maybe kind of the crux of the matter of what we're talking about. So for example, Gary Taubes is all about those carbohydrates, raising insulin, causing the energy to be sucked up into the fat cells, and then people are hungry. So I certainly don't dismiss that idea at all. But there are plenty of people that seem to eat a fair amount of carbohydrates that don't become overweight. So what's that all about? Like for example, I actually don't really like this example because people throw it out without any kind of nuance. But okay, they eat a lot of rice in Japan. So they have obviously historically eaten a lot of rice in Japan, and they didn't have an obesity problem. However, it's more interesting perhaps is that the amount of rice that they've been eating over the last 50 years has dropped dramatically, because they're obviously, a wealthier society. They don't have to eat just white rice all the time. So, what's that all about? They eat a lot of rice, or they did eat a lot of rice, and they weren't overweight, by the carbohydrate insulin hypothesis, one might think, they should all be overweight. So the thing is that they were probably, I'm speculating here, but they ate a lot of rice, but sure, they ate meat and fish as well. So they were getting the protein to keep their appetites down. So you get into all kinds of details and nuance here as to what's going on, and I'm agnostic on the whole question, but I think the protein leverage hypothesis is pretty compelling.
Yeah, it's first of all, I think whether it's right or wrong, it's a great theory, actually. Like it stems from a lot of good observations. And I think from what I've seen so far, and I'm not totally decided on it either, I think it's true in a restricted range. I don't think it holds true quite in that how the the Raubenheimer graph, like their Simpson and that original paper where they have it graphed out. I don't think it's actually following that shape, and I think the range is smaller. That's how I see it. But I do think it accurately describes the behavior of animals in the wild, and I think that's really important. Whether it ends up explaining so much of appetite, I wouldn't bet on it, but I do think it's giving us at least a really important clue as to quality and quantity of protein as being sort of the point of feeding beyond the calories. That's pretty much it, basically, in terms of macronutrients. That's what you're doing at that time, is just getting enough to turn over, to maintain muscle mass, to maintain neurotransmitter levels. It's a very basic thing you're doing. And of course, it tends to come with a lot of micronutrients, basically. Tends to come with fat anyways, and which has fat soluble stuff and all of that. So
right. And so let me ask you then, what do you think is the best evidence for carbohydrate insulin, or just more generally, fat cells sucking up energy and making people hungry?
Yeah. In the end, I don't think the carbohydrate insulin model, as currently named, is gonna be the best name for it. But I think I don't really care that much about it because it stems from an observation of how carbohydrate affects insulin and is thus a clue as to how the insulin signaling is crucial to obesity. And that's the deeper truth that it's pointing at. Now, the question is, if you call it the carbohydrate insulin model, you're saying it's essentially, I don't know, 80%, 90%, 100% of the effect, right? You're not saying it's like 50% of the effect. You're saying it's basically it. That I think there's enough space in biology to say, look, we can show it with what is it, diazide, that has insulin lowering effect. If I'm not messing up the name, basically anything where you can normalize insulin signaling, whether that's sensitizing an adipocyte with linoleic acid, or whether that's jacking up the insulin from carbohydrates and refined carbohydrates, especially. I think that's where those are the two levers that I see explaining at least obesity. And I think because I'm biased towards the idea that actually there's some sampling going on in the brain and in the periphery as to the nutrient status in terms of the energy status. So I think the paper Ludwig showed with regards to the brain and what the sort of the amounts of substrates it sees and the flux that's going on. I think that really is the best way to describe hunger. All that neuroscience-y things about pathways, like it doesn't hold much sway for me. It's not explanatory. It's really descriptive in my mind. I think it really has to do more with nutrient status in the blood and at the level of the adipocyte. Maybe some immune signaling in there, probably something always weird about the immune system and hunger and disease that I tend to see. So it's probably a mix of that. And yeah, I think the hypothesis is right enough to keep taking it really seriously. I think a lot of the methodological porn that's going on about post hoc adjustments and stuff is a lot of nonsense. I think they're really not wrestling with the core issues that Gary is bringing up, because it's basically philosophy. At this point, it's nearly like a logic game, right? We're picking at the definition of words and the arrows of causality and what we mean. Are things well defined? Are they defined just because they're post hoc? Like we call it overeating because you're fat. Like that's not actually a good definition because it's a post hoc definition. Like it doesn't help. And I think we're stuck in these like I don't know what they are, logic loops, philosophy loops, and Gary keeps banging at that door, and that's why everyone is so pissed at him because he's like, I don't care. Like they don't think in that way, and it's a bad thing for them that they don't.
Right. I think that I'll throw in something else about the wave of obesity in the last few decades, and that is meal frequency and availability of food. So the way things stand right now, I mean, I could get up from my desk here and go into my refrigerator and get something to eat easily. And the food is everywhere now. I mean, it's pretty cheap for the most part. And so this is something I feel is pretty different from the way things were, not that long ago, before 1980, let's say. It just wasn't the case. It seems to me that people were eating so frequently through so many hours of the day, and that food was so cheap. And, there are also plenty of other factors too. Sugar content, for example, the presence, the ubiquity of ultra processed foods, which seem to be, uniquely obesogenic as far as, compared to any kind of real whole food. So, those things I think play into it. How much, I don't know, obviously, but I mean, if you go back to that example of, okay, they were eating a bunch of rice in Japan. So yeah, they probably, I assume, people would eat their meal with a lot of rice in it, and then they get up and go back to work, for example, or, or dinner's over, that's it. And that isn't the case now. There's constant snacking, and so I think that has something to do with it, in my view.
No, I think so. I think so too. Frequency definitely matters. It's part of, I think, this dysregulation that's happening at whatever level, and it's not just stuff happening inside us. It's also what's happening in terms of our like larger social incentives and economic incentives. I don't really subscribe to that. It's kind of hard to explain, but I don't subscribe to the like that it's the availability per se. It's not really, that's not where I'd put my finger on it, because I have, I mean, so much food available to me. It's more the question about the food I surround myself with, in a sense. And yeah, of course, at the society level, that's definitely true. We're disadvantaged. Just it's statistics. You're gonna eat shit food the more you're exposed to it. That's a fact at a society level. But at the individual level, it's definitely, you can go from 0 to 100 there. There's much more variation, and I think that's where I'm much more of a sort of like look at the hormones and the metabolism rather than the behavioral aspects. Although changing, like making a conscious decision of when you eat will affect your hormones. So that's also true. We're conscious beings. We can reason and we can make choices that then affect us in very palpable ways. So in that sense, yeah, the behavior matters and the social expectations matter, because you're more likely to try it if you think it's acceptable than if you're a weirdo eating 1 meal a day or 2 meals a day, right?
Right. And yeah, definitely you're a weirdo if you're doing that in
Yeah.
today's society. I think, one fact, if it is a fact, I think so, is to look at in all this, for example, with meal frequency and snacking and availability of food in general, is that let's just say in the 1960s in the United States, people were not exactly health food nuts. I mean,
Right.
there was plenty of junk food around. Maybe not so much junk in the sense of like the typical ultra processed foods that people are eating, but still, I mean, desserts, pies, cakes, cookies, that sort of thing. I mean, I know when I was a kid, and I was a kid in the 1960s, we ate plenty of that stuff. And so I assume everybody else was too. And, obesity wasn't really a problem at the time. I mean, the obesity rate was something like 10% in the 1960s.
Wow, it's 42% today, right? Oh my God.
Right.
That's
I
insane.
think, an interesting distinction here is between overweight and obesity. So when I say that, the obesity rate in the 1960s in the US was 10%, of course, that does not include the merely overweight, right? So you add the overweight people and you get up to, I don't know what the exact figure was at the time. As I recall, maybe 35%. So combined overweight and obesity, right? So what you have now is this approximately 40% obesity rate. Then you add the merely overweight, and you get about another 40%. So you got 80% of the population overweight or obese. So what is the obesity in particular? What is driving it's easier for me to understand how someone can become overweight. Okay, all right, you're a little sedentary, you don't really care that much. Yeah, you're getting a little sloppy, whatever. But obesity is like, somebody has to be really hungry and really eating, a good deal, it seems to me, to become obese. So what is the difference between the 1960s and now? I don't know. I've, thrown out a few suggestions there. Like I said, I think, meal frequency, availability of food in general might just be part of it. I mean, there's the old, I don't want to sound too boomer here, but you know, when you're a kid, you know, and you have dinner and your mother says, you know, you better finish what's on your plate because there won't be anything more until breakfast. So, you know, that was a really common thing. You know, if especially with a relative lack of convenience foods, you know, when your mother or you know, the lady of the household, whoever that might be, was preparing the food, you know, she's not gonna, you know, hey mom, I'm hungry. Well, sorry, it's 9 o'clock at night. Forget it. You know, you're not, you got to wait till breakfast, right? Now it's, oh, okay, well, go get a box of cookies out of the cupboard or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah,
and cultural norms play into that too.
Yeah.
Like, you know, maybe we had that box of cookies back then, but it was like, well, we don't do that. We don't eat a bunch late at night, so forget it. Now we do.
Right, and regardless of whether the norms follow on from the change in biology or if they precede them, because we do invent culture to some degree, to a large degree, right? So you can definitely make an argument for that. So either way, it just makes it hard to change once they're there, and that's what we're dealing with. But to me, you know, everything you said about, you know, what are the big changes and sort of how to think of this at a big picture level, and what really is hunger, this thing that we're fundamentally trying to manage when we're trying to lose fat. Because that's kind of what we're doing in practice. We're thinking about it. We're saying, oh, till my next meal, how did this make me feel? It's all about hunger and feeling you're doing the right thing and seeing that confirmed in the mirror or what. But the elephant, so that made me think of this elephant in the room that is, to my mind, that's the main reason that our response to COVID was so scary in the first wave. It's because we had this like foundation of ill metabolic health that's catastrophic. And in your example where you were saying that people who were not only obese, but also just fat, and imagine if we started to measure the internal fat, I think this would leave just like a ridiculously small amount of people who would be, yeah, you look normal on a DEXA scan for a human, not for a modern human. If you started to measure that, I think we'd be like, what the fuck is going on? There's barely anyone left who has normal adiposity anymore.
It's true. Absolutely true. It's something like, I've looked at these figures fairly closely, and I've written articles on my website about this very thing. When you look at overall, so, you know, there's this phenomenon that is known in technically, I guess, as normal weight obesity. So, you know, people who are normal weight obese have a lot of body fat. They have too much body fat and too little muscle for their allegedly normal weight. And when you throw those people into the mix with the overweight and the obese, you're getting up to like 90% of the American population is in one or the other of those categories. So yeah, very, very small fraction of people have normal body composition. The body composition thing is, I mean, this is something I've talked a lot about, and I think when you utter the phrase body composition, most people don't know what you're talking about, right? And it's like, what do you mean? I mean, because we're used to thinking in terms of body weight only. But, you know, body composition, the relative amounts of fat and muscle, fat, or more technically lean mass, that one has is obviously the most important factor. So, for example, with body mass index, there is the phenomenon where people are technically overweight or sometimes even obese, but they have good body composition. So, you know, at the extreme, again, you might have at the extreme, a bodybuilder. So a bodybuilder, like one who weighs over 200 pounds or something, could be, technically they get on the scale, measure their height and everything, and technically they're obese, but, you know, in terms of body composition, they're anything but obese. some athletes are like this, especially athletes that in sports that require body contact and that sort of thing. They tend to be big people, right? And they're in great shape, even though their BMI says they're overweight or obese. Then you have the other phenomenon, which is actually more common even than this. I often, when I mention body mass index, I often get this thrown at me. Oh, body mass index isn't any good because there's all these athletes that are in good shape and they're overweight or obese. And I say, yeah, how much of the population does that apply to? Low single digit % would be my guess. Maybe even lower, maybe even a fraction of a percent. But on the other end, when you look at people with normal weight, a large number of these people have poor body composition, too high fat, too little lean mass. So body mass index actually underestimates overweight and obesity. And there are even, fairly, learned people who study this that have advocated lowering the thresholds for overweight and obesity, lowering the body mass index threshold. So for example, they're saying that, a woman should be considered overweight at a BMI of 22 and a man at 24. So in any case, being of normal weight or normal body mass index is certainly not a guarantee of good metabolic health, of good body composition. That's kind of what my main message has been all about. You gotta take care of your body composition.
Yeah, I think people hate it because they think it means that you're the stereotype of the personal responsibility bro, like telling people, like it's all if you don't protect yourself, then whatever happens is your fault. And that's not the message. The message is from a public health policy perspective. Like forget even like individual stuff, but just from the public health policy, like there's a massive lever to pull. There's all the evidence that you can pull it fast in people, like doctors do it. It's not impossible. It's something we've done for a long time, and it makes a huge difference to glycemia and thus hospitalization rates and all of that. And it's people have made this into diet wars and stuff, but I don't care. At this point, it's just so obvious how you control glycemia fast with the diet or the absence of food. It's like, come on, like if you're serious about making, actually doing something about the mortality rate, because that's what we care about in an epidemic. It's not all about transmission, for heaven's sake. It's also about like, do people suffer? Do they go to hospital? Do they die? Like, how old do they die? All that stuff. So if we actually pulled those metabolic markers, it would be an actually serious effort. And until that happens, I'm never going to be able to think that they're taking this quite seriously. I don't think it's a knowledge problem. I think it's a politics, it's a culture problem. It's not a medical issue fundamentally.
I would tend to agree with you that it's not a knowledge problem, that it's culture and politics. I think that personally, I would like it if people in authority who have the podium and getting the message out would at least talk about this stuff. So if we couldn't, from a public policy point of view, there may be not a lot that can be done. I'm not sure, but if they would at least say, hey, look, that the ranks of obese people are quite overrepresented, among people who get hospitalized for this illness, and that diabetics and people with glucose intolerance are highly represented in among these people. At least if they would talk about it. But I really don't see anybody talking about it. I mean, certainly in our like in our corner of Twitter and stuff, we talk about it but I don't see like mainstream news media articles. I don't see Dr. Fauci talking about it. Why isn't he talking about it? I mean, I could be mistaken. I don't hang on his every word by any means. Maybe he's mentioned it,
No,
but
you're right. You're right.
The 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 other thing is that as far as obesity and metabolic health, in terms of the public, I hate to be a pessimist here, but it's getting to be a well nigh intractable problem.
Yeah.
There are too many factors at work, too many interests at work for it to go away. I mean, we have big food companies, and we have the pharmaceutical companies, and we have academics and health authorities and medical experts. And from my viewpoint, I've thought a lot about this, but from my viewpoint, none of those players have an interest in this going away. Obviously the big food companies want to keep selling what they're selling, and what they are selling is highly profitable. I think this is an underappreciated fact in my opinion, that when you take a bunch of white flour and sugar and vegetable oils and mix them all together and slap a brand name on them and then advertise it, you've got something that's just really profitable, as opposed to meat and vegetables, right? And
That's
so
true.
yeah. I mean, I did. I was talking about this recently. A box of Cheerios, which is brand name breakfast cereal here, in the U.S., actually costs more per pound than ground beef. So, and the ingredients are far cheaper.
Yeah.
So there's that. Then the pharmaceutical companies, they don't, they're doing fine. They don't have any interest in. I mean, if they could develop a pill that would solve obesity, sure, I'm sure they would like to do that, but they've tried and they haven't. And so,
Right.
and then academic medicine, or more broadly, mainstream health authorities, they would really have to backtrack on everything they've been saying for the last several decades, and they would really lose face doing that, in my opinion. Careers have been built upon this, and so they're I mean, I'm sure you've seen yourself in the controversies around, for example, low carbohydrate diets. I mean, you've got people out there, the dietitians and doctors and so on, screaming how dangerous it is, and that this, we should never do this and all this. So that is very gradually changing, but there is a lot of there are a lot of people out there who have built their careers and trained in such a way that this is all wrong. It's still, you got to eat low saturated fat, high carbohydrates. That's the way you got to do. So the larger point, anyway, what I'm just saying is that obesity is a huge problem. I don't see it going away anytime soon. I don't see any public policy responses that are really going to make a lot of difference. I could be wrong. Maybe I should hope I'm wrong here. But it's just too profitable. It's too embedded in the culture, and that's how I see it.
Yeah, I think what you're describing is kind of, it's scary when you think that we could have that very same problem with COVID, in the sense that now we're entrenched in our approach to it, and we're just going to get more of that until something gives, and we get lucky, it disappears, or something, or the vaccine works better than expected, and great. But yeah, I'm fearful what you're describing is maybe happening in this situation as well. And the two are linked, because like I said, I think the bad dietary guidelines and everything else that contributes to this unhealthy modern lifestyle is just set us up to get destroyed by this thing way more than we otherwise would have. Yeah. So
right.
How's that for pessimism?
Yeah, right. I agree with you. I mean, I see, aside from arguing about responses to COVID, in more general terms, I see interests lined up,
Yeah,
just like as
exactly.
you said, where so I mean, let's say in the UK, where they've had about among the hardest of lockdowns, as far as I can tell, you know, can the government really just say, well, no, okay, we decided this, we're doing this wrong, when you know half the economy is getting destroyed. They talk about losing face. I mean,
Yeah.
they couldn't survive something like that. So
Yeah, and I just wonder how longer it will go on for, because I mean the yeah, all the economic issues have not totally manifest yet. I think there's
right.
most of it hasn't appeared. So we're definitely not ready for that yet, but yeah, I don't know how long they can I don't know if their propaganda is going to be able to hold up for much longer, because I really do think it's propaganda at the level of what you know they're doing in order to justify a lot of what they've done. And look how they fucked up the vaccine schedule. I mean, it was so predictable. It was so
Right.
predictable. It's insane. They yeah, and it's stupid because now you're applying a selective pressure by not having the second dose in the way that you've tested it, and you're likely messing up in the direction where it's going to have more pressure in order to not have a complete or as potent response, and you might not, you know, you might get all the negative side effects, and who knows about the immunity. And it's terrible for what the UK has done. They've messed up big time there.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with that. I mean, the thing is that as far as I can tell, most people support what's going on.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's so it. I feel like, how shall I say? I feel like I'm better informed than the average person about this. They're only hearing what they. I don't mean about the UK in particular, but just in general. They only hear what they're hearing on the news media, and it's
Yeah.
totally pro government action, pro lockdown, for example, and so most people support it. So there's, as I see it, there's every incentive for governments, for politicians to keep doing what they're doing. They don't have much of incentive to let up unless they get to the point where they feel like they're literally destroying the economy. You know, then maybe they will, but then by then maybe it'll be too late. I don't know.
You know, it's crazy. I've had so many personal anecdotes reflect a lot of the larger things that we're seeing at the societal level. Like, so we're seeing more fathers beating daughters or sons, right, at home, or husbands beating wives and stuff like that. So I was running outside on the seafront in my hometown in France over the Christmas holidays, and on my way back, a young 16-year-old girl stopped me in the street, and she was like, you know, shaking and saying that she'd been beaten by her dad, who was basically crazy and stuff. So I ended up staying with her for like 1 hour on the seafront, waiting for the police and her mom to come pick her up. And I was, of course, like an idiot in my five-finger shoes, in shorts, running shirtless. So I was like sitting next to to this young girl on the bench with people looking at me weird until the police arrived. So it all ended well in that sense. But I think it's probably not just a coincidence. We know the rates are, you know, going much higher in terms of violence in the households. Also, all the problems we've seen with hospitals where people can't get their normal care. I have very good close neighbor of mine who's in his 70, I think he's 74 this year, and he has some cardiac issues that he didn't take care of, in part, and not only because he doesn't pay much attention to his health, but also because he was scared to go to the hospital and go see a doctor because he felt there was a risk with COVID. which there is. But anyways, let's get over that. So there's this. There's my dad had a health issue. Same thing. It was hard to see him in the hospital. The care was terrible. We had to fight with nurses and doctors to get him the right care during COVID in the first wave. So I've sort of seen this up front, and for me, it's clear that we're not providing good care for COVID patients because of lockdowns and mismanagement of resources. And we're also fucking up the good things we're doing with vaccines in other parts of the world. Vaccines for tuberculosis, which are great and have a great impact. Now we're fucking up that supply chain, and we're doing harm to the vaccine programs. And then we're telling people they should care about vaccines and follow the rules. So like it's so stupid to my mind what we're doing. It's so much wasted energy.
I couldn't agree with you more, to be honest. I mean, you mentioned domestic violence, and there's also alcohol and drug abuse, divorces, basically from the fallout from people being unemployed and being confined at home. I posted something the other day where these economists, just for the US alone, estimated 890 over the next 15 years, 890,000 excess deaths due to lockdown, and basically due to the effects of massive unemployment, because that exacerbates all kinds of social problems, just like the ones we've just mentioned. So
poverty is a great killer. I don't know why they don't pay attention to that. Poverty is like it's an old friend, it's been with us forever. We know how bad it is. That's why we have economic systems that work. That's why we don't interrupt supply chains.
Right.
I don't know. It's so crazy that we copied China in their response.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Well, China doesn't seem to be copying us now. Everything seems to be wide open there.
Yeah.
And certainly as far as poverty, there are obviously many people in the world that don't have the level of affluence that we do in the West. And so when you talk about them getting poorer, they're dropping below a threshold that's really bad. They can really have a large impact on mortality rates and so on, just from what's going on economically, even if they aren't in any kind of a hard lockdown, because obviously the world is interconnected now. Our economic problems affect them. And so, I mean, I've seen, I can't quote exact figures now, but I've seen some items about how much increased, loss of life just lockdowns are going to cause across the world. And in poorer countries, it's going to be pretty significant.
Yeah. And most of us in the West are far from that. I mean,
right.
So it's hard for people to see. But, I don't know if 2021 is going to bring us better things in that regard, but I'm at least pleased by the whole. I've had a lot of interesting discussions about it. I'll say that. Despite the topic being so like annoyingly important and heavy and on everyone's mind, and we're also tired of it, yet it's also interesting. I've learned quite a lot, actually, having to try to understand many different fields. It's been really interesting to try to put together immunology with like public health and all of that. So yeah, I've actually learned quite a bit. I think more people should interview like Kevin McKernan. He's one of the geneticists who's done a lot of the explaining, I would say, of what went wrong with the PCR and with the primers, and it was great. I think I hope a lot of people who are in that field will learn from him, because he's those people should get more of the limelight, I think.
Yes, it's certainly it's a maybe surprisingly polarizing topic to talking about all this. I mean, people have their beliefs and so basically because people certainly are dying from COVID. So you get this element in there of when you have disagreement, then fingers start getting pointed. And so, yeah, I found it let's just say polarizing, kind of difficult to talk about. Certainly if you're having a more or less intellectual discussion with someone, it is interesting to talk about. But for example, on social media, though, it's really, really polarizing.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Oh man, there's one last thing I wanted to ask you. What would you recommend? What would you recommend are the three things? Yeah, let's end on that. What would you recommend are like the 3 to 5 things people should really do for themselves? I would say, yeah, mainly diet wise for COVID, because I know you talk about supplements as well, and I think there's actually a good case to do some preventative stuff in that sense, because there's so little downside to getting that stuff right. So maybe you want to finish on that.
Right. Well, sure. So one thing I mentioned when this first started happening is about metabolic health. So we know that metabolic health, along with obesity, they tend to go together. Metabolic ill health and obesity tend to go together. Is that these people are at much higher risk for hospitalization, and serious illness from COVID-19. So one point I've tried to make is that you can improve your metabolic health rapidly. So I'm sure there are plenty of people out there that, might be saying something like, oh, I'm 30 pounds overweight. What's the point? This illness is here now. But I don't agree with that position. You can improve your metabolic health rapidly. It doesn't necessarily involve rapid weight loss or something like that. So, I have been using the shorthand sun, steak, and steel for, basically my philosophy of health, right? So sun means getting, that's shorthand for safe sun exposure, fresh air, and if you can't get those things, vitamin D supplementation. So sun provides more than just vitamin D, but vitamin D is an important part of that. Fresh air, is obvious, and the vitamin D supplementation. There's a lot of interesting work on this in regard to COVID, in regard to both vitamin D treatment and vitamin D sufficiency in people, whether they're high risk. So that's one thing. So steak, that kind of embodies my diet philosophy. Ditch the high carb, ultra processed foods. Eat real whole food. My preference is for low in carbohydrates, and so you can definitely improve your metabolic health quickly that way. I mean, this. I know the studies where diabetics stop eating carbohydrates and their blood sugars get normal pretty quickly. And then steel, the last one, that refers to my preferred exercise, which is lifting weights. I think that it's a very, I guess, you could say underrated form of exercise. In my opinion, it's the best exercise. It's just hardly emphasized or even really spoken of at all in terms of exercise. They're always talking about aerobic activity and so on. So that's what I would say. I mean, I could go a lot further into this, but sun, steak, and steel embodies, what I believe people should do to get metabolically healthy, and it can happen pretty quickly if you dive in earnest.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic advice. I think that's wise. I think people should listen to that. And I hope they do. I mean, if they're listening to us, they probably do to some degree. but the wider public should definitely do that. I'll say that in so how did I fulfill this today? Did I fulfill your Sun Steak and Steel? I did some deadlifts, some dumbbell thrusters, and some pull-ups in the gym. So I guess I got the steel part. I walked home from it shirtless to get some sun. So I wasn't,
Awesome.
it wasn't exactly fresh air. It was in the street next to some cars, but it was at least I had some sunshine for a few minutes. And steak, oh, I definitely had a massive piece of Angus steak from my very friendly local butcher.
Nice.
So yeah, I definitely lived that today, and I think it's the simple things that you can do like that on a daily basis. Oh, I'll add a fourth one because why not? I took a cold shower this morning, and a cold shower is always a cold shower. Make no mistake. I don't care if you're Wim Hof or whoever. Cold shower is a cold shower, and that's the good thing about it. It's never easy.
Every time.
Yeah,
yes.
Don't get me wrong. It can be totally fun. You can fuck around in the snow, doing ice baths and stuff. It can be fun, but it's never easy. Like,
right.
That's the thing about it. So people yeah, you'll get used to it. You'll get adapted. You won't have your breath reflex totally spaz up on you. But in the end, it's cold water is it kind of makes you. It reminds you you're alive, and I love that about it. Just reminds you you're alive. Don't fuck around. We're in the cold now. You can't be thinking about your bullshit,
Right. Yeah, I agree. I had my cold shower this morning. I do it every day. And
nice.
Yeah. You never get used to it. I mean, it's like you said, it's always cold. So, and I went walking outside in the sun and fresh air. I did my weight training yesterday. And then I had eggs for breakfast. So
perfect.
Yeah. So far I'm on the Sun Steak and Steel prescription.
Yeah. I think that's honestly that prescription. If you could get a prescription, I think you'd half the. I'm making this up, but I think you could half the death rate we got from COVID just by doing those things. As widely as is realistic that you think they'd get adopted, but I think it'd do a massive difference.
Yeah, I agree completely. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that makes us heretics, but at least it's worth it. At least I think we're making sense on that thing. So I'm fine with that.
Yeah.
Happy with that. Okay, Dennis, thank you so much for taking the time. We should not only should we do this again, we should probably do it with someone else on the podcast as well, and just bring up a topic of interest. And
that would be really good. I really enjoyed it, Raphael. Really enjoyed talking to you. So yeah.
And so who would you suggest? Do you have anyone in mind right now? You don't have to give a name, but if you do, who would you think who would be fine?
I could if I thought about it, there's probably a few people in my Twitter feed that I could think of that would be good to have.
Perfect.
Yeah.
You should exactly. Let's do that. When you decide, whenever you're free next time, you choose someone and bring them on, and we'll talk about whatever.
Okay. Sounds good.
Cool. Okay. All right. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.